So I have my pressed strap here. Now if you've made it with faux leather, then you will have clipped all the way along the side, and those central pieces will have been stuck down. You don't need to do that with fabric, using a bit of double-sided tape or even a bit of glue. Now before we get started, I'm using a Juki TL98P sewing machine. She's a straight stitch only machine. I have a size 14 universal needle in my machine, and I am using a Teflon foot even though I don't need to. I am a prolific faux leather sewer, and I tend to use my Teflon foot for everything. You can use your standard sewing foot for this. You don't need a Teflon foot unless you're sewing with faux leather. Now initially my first line of top stitching will be a 1/4 inch in from the open edge, so the edge where those two folded edges meet, and I've turned my stitch length to 4, and I'm just going to stitch from one end down to the other. Now what I tend to do is, now you excuse me because the phone's just going, so I may have to turn off my video because there's nobody here to answer it. So I tend to stitch all the way down, and one thing I will say is make sure that you have a full bobbin of thread that matches your top thread. So you want the same colour thread on the top and the bottom, unless of course you decide that you want it to be different because you want a design feature. And I'm going to literally stitch all the way down. Now I have my strap coming up. Okay, I have my strap coming up and over my shoulder so that the strap is coming straight onto the machine. It helps me to make sure that my stitching is straight. And that's how I always do it. So I've put my needle in. I don't need to back stitch, but I will do just one back stitch at the beginning because it's habit more than anything else. And I'm very carefully using the side of my foot, because I know that this is a 1/4 inch foot, to stitch all the way down the length of my strap. I'm just going to remove the clips as I get to them and do this slowly. Because you want those folded sides there to match perfectly. We're just going to go all the way down one side of the strap. And you can see, because I've got my strap kind of up and over my shoulder, it always feeds to the needle straight on. If you have it kind of over here, you're going to find that you're trying to stitch almost around a corner. It doesn't work that way. It's a much easier thing to do if you have your strap thrown over your shoulder. The only thing I will say is if you're going to do that, don't wear loopy earrings, because if you do, the little clips will catch in your loopy earrings and you'll suddenly find your head heading down towards your machine, which you don't want, because the clips will catch. So now I've sewn all the way from one end to the other, and that folded edge is now sewn together. Now I like to do a second line of top stitching. I'm just going to remove my threads. That is 1/8 of an inch in, so halfway between my first line of stitching and the edge of my fabric. So I'm just gonna throw my strap over my shoulder again, and because I don't have to take any clips out, I can do a single run without having to sort of stop and start. Now if you're worried about doing a straight line, you can use a seam guide that you can stick to your needle plate, or I just use my fingers. I basically put my fingers one either side and just allow the fabric to thread through my fingers, and because it comes off of my shoulder straight, I get a straight line of stitching. So now some of you will be asking, why do I do that second line of stitching? And I'll show you why. Because my first line of stitching is 1/4 inch away, that side can still open up, and it looks a bit bulky because there's a sort of a gap between. You can actually fit your fingernail down there. If you do a second line of stitching, it flattens out the side of your strap. I also think it looks really nice. And you don't get that sort of opening at the side of your strap that sometimes can happen if you do your first line of stitching and only stitch 1/4 of an inch. I do find it easier to do the 1/4 inch stitching first though. All the way down to the other end. So that's one side of our strap completed. Now I'm going to go to the other side of my strap. Now the one thing I will say is when you're sewing a strap, always try and sew both sides from the same end. So if you've come from this end and worked down, then you need to start at this end and work down again. Now, because I'm using the same colour thread on both the top and the bottom, I'm actually going to turn my strap over. If you don't, then you'll end up having to stitch that way. So you'll have the side of your strap on your 1 inch mark on your needle plate. I just find that's a fiddle. If you've used the same colour thread in your bobbin as you have in your top on the top of your machine, you shouldn't need to do that. So you can now repeat the same process on the other side of your strap. Again, I've thrown it over my shoulder and I'm using my fingers to keep the strap nice and straight. The reason that we stitch from the same end both times is because if you stitch from the opposite end, on occasions, not so much with fabric, but certainly with faux leather, you'll get a twist in your strap or puckers that are unsightly and difficult to get rid of. And people often say, oh, my strap is twisting. If you hold it up, it'll sort of twist. And that's because you've stretched your faux leather or your fabric as you've done your stitching, and you've stitched from 2 different directions. You can sometimes avoid that by reducing the needle, the presser foot pressure, but not all machines have that facility. So I find the easiest way is just to make sure that I stitch from the same end for both well, for all 4 lines of stitching. And again, you can see I'm just using my fingers as a guide to hold the strap nice and straight, and I'm using the side of my foot as my guide for excuse me, to ensure I've got a nice straight line. So I'm going to go back to the first end again. I'm just going to get rid of my little bits of thread, and I'm going to do my second line of stitching at 1/8 of an inch. Whilst it's not essential that you back stitch, I think for most of it it's habitual. But this does take some practice. So if you're not sure, then cut yourself a little practice strap and just practice stitching along it to get your stitching nice and straight. I tend to slow down as I get towards the end, otherwise I find myself zooming away when I've got nothing actually stitching underneath my foot anymore. And there we have it, one strap. Now I'm just going to trim off those very ends because I've got a little bit of interfacing that's sticking out the ends where I didn't trim it off very well. Got rid of any stray ends. And there we have one beautiful strap with 2 lines of stitching. It looks perfect. Very happy with that. So I'm just going to roll that up and pop it in a safe place because we don't actually need the strap at the moment. We will use that. We will actually add the hardware and what have you to our strap later on. But I'm notorious for losing these once I've made them. So wrap it up, pop a clip on it just to hold it in place, and pop it in a safe place. And there you go, that's your strap ready to use later on.